Welcome to this installment of my video series on special education staffing in San Francisco Unified School District. This edition explores how a new staffing allocation process impacted an already strained inclusion program at Washington High School. In 2019, a debate was raging at George Washington High School. The Board of Education was garnering national attention because of its efforts to cover murals that depicted the troubled history of America's past. This topic consumed board meeting after board meeting. But inside the same building, new troubling history was being made. Cindy Sawchuk was one of the few veteran special education teachers who had stayed with the district. She was also an adjunct faculty member at California State University East Bay, teaching evening classes on inclusive practices. But this year, something big changed. The district came up with a new formula for allocating staff, and it meant Cindy and the whole SPED team at Washington would need to make a difficult decision. Here's Peter Graham, then department chair at Washington High School, talking about what happened.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Graham, and I have been working at SFUSD as an education specialist, special ed teacher, and for 11 years, I was the special education department head at George Washington High School. And I can tell you at WASH, we had a program. It used to be called the Inclusion Program before the district did our district did its, after we got the audit, we were going for full inclusion. It then became inclusion practices. But what it was, and I think, Anne, your work actually might have inspired this. We had a teacher named Jane Blanchard who started this inclusion program, which was, at that point, we had 10 students who were identified with moderate severe students who were fully accessing the general ed classroom. They had no SDC classes. They were getting in the general ed classroom and they were accessing the education at their level, at their ability. And we had a lot of resources dedicated to that. And then Cindy Sawchuk, who is now doing it there, came aboard and we expanded it to 2 programs. And we supported that program through through the allocation of our resources. And we made a decision because that was such an important program that we did kind of rob Peter to pay Paul. We did take some para-education resources and put them with those students in the classes because we felt that's where it was needed. And kind of like our resource program, they were supposed to be assigned to para, that's where we kind of lost some support. However, we felt that was really important to keep this going. Now, over the last few years, what has happened with that is the district started to change the way that they were allocating resources. It became more based on this pathway. It didn't matter, it seemed, that if we put in the IEP, that there was additional adult support. That didn't matter anymore. It was all based on if the student was they were basing it more on SAI minutes. And so here you have a mod severe student who is in general ed, so they're not getting necessarily SI minutes, and not all the classes were co-taught, so the students were no longer being allocated those resources. So we were increasingly having students who we couldn't cover as much because of some of the changes in that structure. So
Cindy had successfully preserved inclusion support services for some of the students with disabilities that required the greatest level of support in the classroom. She had held on through the audit recommendations. She had held on through the closure of 100 special day classes. And she had held on through the layoff of 2,000 paraeducators. She had done this because the staffing ratio of her program was, as the contract used to require, at the level of a special day class. In other words, it was 8 to 10 students to 1 teacher and 2 paraeducators. But now the program will be staffed at a 22-to-1 ratio with only 1 paraeducator. In February of 2019, the Special Education Department issued a memo describing new allocation formulas. The new guidelines had 3 new job categories: RSP low intensive, RSP high intensive, and RSP mod to severe. The target caseload for all was 22 students in K through 12, and the paraeducator ratio would also be 1 per caseload. Recall that a typical caseload grows by 4 or more students per year, so beginning the year at 22 would often lead to caseloads of 28 students by the end of the year. However, if the students were enrolled in special day classes, the caseload would drop to their earlier levels, and the teachers would receive an additional paraeducator. This begs 2 interesting questions. What were the new job titles? And 2, what would teachers with inclusive programs do under the pressure of the new guidelines? To begin, the Special Education Department, in partnership with Human Resources, created a new position, Resource Service Provider. If you think that sounds a lot like Resource Specialist, you're not mistaken. And conveniently, it had the same acronym, RSP. But the position was created without union engagement, and it marked the official end of the Resource Specialist program. Additionally, it had no caseload limits, and it had responsibilities to serve students without IEPs in addition to those with IEPs. The new RSPs could now be required to attend all student support team meetings at the school in addition to administering all IEP meetings. So now to answer the second question, the allocation table created. What would happen to the SDC classrooms at school sites? Cindy held on firm. She wanted the small caseload and high paraeducator ratio that the contracts had previously promised, but the department chair was in a bind. Doing that would mean starting all other teachers at the site with caseloads of 28 and reduced paraeducator availability. As had happened many times before, Special Education Central was pitting special education teachers against one another. In most schools, the teachers were new. Staff turnover guaranteed that. Teachers either didn't know any better or they were on probationary status and afraid to speak up. So the new allocation table rolled out easily, but not Cindy. Cindy wrote to Margaret Ferrugio, the author of the new allocation table, and Matt Lavoie, the SPED supervisor for high schools at the time. Cindy sought their advice. The response was insulting. Margaret Ferrugio quoted the Urban Collaborative report as justification for her allocation table, but that report had recommended high school caseloads limits of 14 students in high schools with 1 paraeducator. That 14 limit was the limit for the end of school year, not the beginning. An allocation table is used to set start of year numbers with the understanding that caseloads would grow. And Margaret was suggesting a start at 22 students. And of course, it didn't reinforce the charge of what the Inclusion Task Force had started. It undermined the entire work of the Inclusion Task Force. Peter Graham, the department chair from Washington High School, ultimately requested a transfer to another school, where caseloads were protected by the contract. I don't know what happened the following year, and I haven't been able to contact Cindy. My guess is she left the district. I would also guess that her students were mostly pushed back into special day classes, or that they had much more difficulty reaching their IEP goals. Here's Peter Graham explaining how the allocation process changed between 2008 and 2019. While Margaret Ferrugio would say inclusion is alive at Washington High School, the truth is inclusion cannot work at the ratios she defined. She succeeded in saving the district another several $1,000,000, but at what cost to students and staff?
The way it worked is that there was a mod severe. So the way it started when I was working as department head is that if a teacher had a moderate severe credential, whether their students were being served in a general ed classroom or in a separate class, that their caseload was capped at 10. And that's how it was. I didn't know where that, I just assumed that was part of, I think at one point it may have been part of the contract. I don't know. It was, right? Okay. So that, and so for years, that's how we did it. And then, and so when you had an inclusive practices inclusion program where you had students that were being served fully in general ed, with a lot of support, co-teaching or additional adult support, paraeducator, they were supposed, that's how they were, you still supported them. But then, as I said, the district went back and this started to do this other way of calculating how teachers were allocated and paraeducators were allocated, and finding how it turned out that there were less teachers and less paraeducators in this new method. Yes. So we often, like we had to do a lot of fighting for services. We had to do a lot of fighting for caseload sizes, you know, I think it was my last year there, I think it was my last straw was, they did this dog and pony show. Special ed folks came out from the district. There was an assistant superintendent there. We made our case for what we needed in terms of teachers, for para educators. We said this was according to our IEPs. I think we used one of your forms, Anne, that was in your book, you know, and it said this is what we needed. And they said, okay, thanks. The next year we came back, less teachers, less paras.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's basically just a way to kill inclusion if you, it can't work that way.
Basically, just a way to kill inclusion. Here, Dr. Tom Green discusses the legal mandate provided by an IEP to provide services. And the new allocation table was leading to thousands of students not receiving services in their IEPs because there simply weren't enough minutes in the school day to serve all students on the caseload. Recall that over 60%, nearly 70% of SPED teachers stated that they could not meet the services of students on their caseloads. So that means that hundreds of students of IEPs were out of compliance from a service perspective.
And what happens when we have accurately assessed that a child needs a particular service and the system that we're working in is failing to provide that service? And it's important to remind ourselves of what the law says. We are legally obligated to provide those services if we have accurately assessed the kid and effectively designed a program to meet their needs. We write it into the IEP, we get informed consent by all parties, and then it becomes the LEA, the district's responsibility to figure out how to provide that service. And on that note, just again to remind us, an IEP, it's important for us to think of it this way, is a legally binding contract. What we write into that IEP is not, we cannot arbitrarily decide not to provide the services that have been agreed upon in that contract.
The district controlled the number of SDC classrooms in elementary schools and the number of rooms in high school where students receive more than 50% of their special education instruction in special day classes. So at the elementary level, there was no option to return a student to a special day class when they failed to make progress on goals in general education. And there was no staff available to increase supports for a student in the general education classroom either. So many students who did not receive SPED supports began acting out in classrooms. As the co-chair of the UESF Special Education Committee, I frequently fielded calls from general education teachers who felt they were not receiving the SPED support they needed, and that they had called IEP meetings and were told nothing could be done to support them. Site administrators were as helpless as anyone to solve the challenge because allocations were being controlled by the district's central special education office. But middle and high schools could create special day classes for single subjects. Although the students enrolled in these classes were still enrolled at a caseload target, not cap, of 22 students per teacher and para. So Cindy's students likely ended up in these classes, which frequently had inadequate paraeducator support. Returning to the quote in our earlier videos, we see that the resource service provider now had a caseload of 28 students by the end of the year, that these students had varying exceptionalities, and that the resource specialist had one paraeducator to support them. At these ratios, the teacher and paraeducator could not be present in classrooms except at the most crucial moments. This left the burden of implementing supports and services on general education teachers, who lacked the training to implement the IEP. Again, it's the presence of skilled staff that we're looking for, and there just weren't enough skilled staff to be present. Summary: a new job title and a new allocation table raised effective caseloads to 28 students and eliminated the positions of resource specialist and inclusion support teacher, replacing them with the position of resource service provider. Next, the community speaks out. I organized a panel in the February of 2020 of professionals, educators, attorneys, UESF members to speak out about what was happening in special education. We'll feature more of their testimony in the next slideshow.